And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anthony Picco, and tonight or today, wherever you are time-wise, the discussion is Saturn is not the problem. And we're really going to look over some basic Saturn stuff and take my particular viewpoint of it. And I got the inspiration for this particular chat because I was going on Facebook, and I'm a Capricorn, so I decided, let me be the wise elderly, expert and go help the kids on Facebook. And there's a Saturn support group, and I went in there and I discovered that the kids are idiots. Okay. um, I have never seen so much misappropriation and unawareness of what Saturn actually does. I even took a few quotes of things that people posted, which absolutely kill me. Here's one. Those with happy Saturn returns, describe it and post your chart, because that never happens. Can someone with Sun conjunct Saturn be successful? Or is it a completely negative aspect? I'm familiar with negative connotations, but what are some possible positive manifestations of Saturn in the seventh house conjunct Mars? I have it. It's okay with me. My wife has trouble with it, but I'm okay with it. Nothing, this one is completely insane. Nothing quite says Saturn returns, Sagittarius third house, like being held up at an airport due to transportation issues. Can you get more petty? Searching for the silver lining. Come on, Sag, I know you have one. And the last one I saw was a meme of a person with a very upset face. And it said, when you're preparing for your Saturn return and trying to figure out how to keep your life from falling apart, and you can't. Okay. What amazes me is how many people learn just enough astrology to curse Saturn and curse Pluto too, but that's another lecture, and say that their lives would be so much better if Saturn wasn't in their chart. And I want to start with a basic statement about astrology. There's nothing wrong with any one of us. Saturn squaring your sun or squaring your Mars or conjunct your moon is not going to destroy your life. We're all born, in my personal opinion, perfect, and we come in with some challenges and some issues to work out because that's what we chose to do. Okay, it's not as horrible as people seem to think it is. And one of my favorite quotes that kind of makes sense to me is Ralph Waldo Emerson: as long as a man stands in his own way, everything seems to be in his way. So Saturn, Saturn is about, among other things, control, limitations, structure, discipline, responsibility, delay, focus, aim, restriction, integrity, denial, consequences, social contract, and a bias in our beliefs. And Saturn represents how we structure our world, our interpretation of our world. My favorite sentence that I came up with eventually was, Saturn represents the beliefs we have that we think are facts. And what I want to use as an example, and a very simplified one, is you may grow up and maybe mommy drank and always beat your dad until she drove him away. And so you grow up thinking that men are supposed to find women that are drunks who beat them and make them run away, and men will run away because that's what men always do. And that's the structure you take and you incorporate into your life because that's what you first learned. So to a certain degree, Saturn symbolizes all of the negative and positive baggage we carry with us from childhood, which is why the Saturn return becomes so important, but we will get into that in a moment or two. One of my favorite metaphors is there's an old story of there's a traveling couple and they come to the outskirts of a city, and they stop a man outside the city and they say, well, what's it like in the city up ahead? We've never been there before. And the old man says, well, what was it like in the city you left? And they said, oh, it was terrible. They overcharged us. They cheated us. They tried to rob us. The accommodations were terrible. And then the old man says, well, I'm sorry. It's going to be like that in the town up ahead. And a little while later, another couple comes along and says, hey, can you tell us what it's going to be like in the town up ahead. And the old man says the same thing. What was it like in the town you left? And the people said, oh, it was fabulous. They were so kind to us. They helped us. It really changed our lives. And he says, well, that's what you're going to find in the city up ahead. That's Saturn. It's the set of beliefs you carry with us that shapes the way you interpret the world. I know the ascendant is often referred to as how you see the world and how the world sees you. But I'm going to say Saturn is the bias we carry with us about how we see the world. And one of the problems with trying to change that is because we learn these things when we were children. And many times we would rather be right and prove what we already believe than be happy or evolve. You know, it's the old phrase, I'll believe it when I see it. For Saturn, you should really turn it around and say, I'll see it when I believe it, when I finally accept its reality. We have psychologists talk about a web of beliefs that we have to construct our world. That's Saturn. But Saturn is also the planet that holds our chart together. Mars wants to run over and, I don't know, start a fire and stab somebody. Venus wants to fall in love. The moon wants to feel things. Neptune wants to space out. And Saturn's there pulling everybody together and saying, come on, we got to work together. We've got to have some sort of structure. We've got to have some kind of a focus. And one of my favorite metaphors for Saturn, the effect of Saturn and what Saturn can do in your chart, if you use it in the best possible way, I look at light. You know, you turn on a light bulb and it fills up the room, and that's wonderful. But when the scientists finally learned how to take all the beams of light and focus them together into a coherent beam, it becomes a laser beam and it burns through steel. That's what discipline, that's what focus can do when you can work with Saturn as opposed to fighting it every step of the way. Confirmation bias is one of the things I often use as a concept with Saturn, where we listen to what we want to hear that proves what we think we already know. And I had two friends years ago, and it was kind of funny because Lee, they both had the same kind of car. And Lee would drive into the city to see me, and Lee would tell me that he always had to leave 30 minutes early because it takes that long to find parking in New York. And he always took him 30 minutes to find a parking space. As a matter of fact, he got his trunk punched out a few times and his stuff stolen because, you know, bringing a car into the city, it's dangerous and it's bad. And that was his belief system. And I had a girlfriend at the time named Anne with the same kind of car. And Anne always believed she would find a parking space wherever she needed one. And it amazed the hell out of me. We would be driving down the block. It would be bumper to bumper parking. And right at where she wanted to pull in, somebody would pull out when she got there. So our beliefs have a very strong influence on the physical world, and that's a big thing about Saturn. Saturn represents the physical world, the illusion that creates the physical world. Well, Saturn's very hard keeping it under control. And control is a very key word with Saturn. Many of us see control as a force that we impose on something. Perhaps we like grab it and we hold it down and we make it do what we want to do. And yes, that is a form of control. It's also exhausting. It wastes your energy. And a healthier form of control, I always like to prefer that an evolved form of control is like a surfer. They paddle out and they see when the wave is coming, and that's when they get up on their board, and that's when they go with it. And a good form of control, and the healthiest possible form of what we call control, is when you understand and sense all of the energy around you and you work with it, as opposed to trying to impose your will upon it, which is why young Capricorns are often extremely frustrated as they try to control everything around them and they realize they have to relax and let go and tune in. Remember, Saturn is a so-called negative sign, a so-called female or yin sign, and it's more about receptivity than the aggressive or assertive male or yang signs that we have in the zodiac. So delay. Saturn is often cursed with oh, I would be married by now, but I have Saturn in my seventh house, or I'd have a career now, but Saturn's on my midheaven and it's delaying things. And I want to say Saturn doesn't delay things just to be mean. Saturn isn't actually even delaying anything. Saturn understands in your chart that this is where you need to learn something. You need to understand something, and therefore you have to be ready. And Saturn waits until you're ready. So Saturn in your seventh house doesn't mean you're going to get married when you're 57. It means you'll get married when you're ready to get married, which is why early marriage with Saturn in the seventh house falls apart, because presumably you're not ready. But if you're an evolved person, you could be getting married at 25 or 30, and that's fine because you've passed Saturn's tests, you've done Saturn's homework, and Saturn always rewards you when you've done your homework and gotten things done. Okay, let me just check through a couple of pieces of paper here. Oh yeah, there's something else I wanted to mention about the struggle of Saturn, and about that whole sense that there's something wrong with you. In the early Aramaic language, in the New Testament, the word that we translate as sin literally means to miss the point. And if you go back to Hebrew, the word sin translates literally as an error in judgment. So Saturn is not punishment. Saturn is just the way it is. And you may make mistakes, but it doesn't mean you should beat yourself up, and you didn't mean you should drive yourself crazy. Saturn is about rules and restrictions and focus. And that's the important thing to remember. Saturn also creates rules. So Saturn understands structure well enough to know when a structure has to be built. Okay. So just give me a moment here as I go through my papers. So the first thing about Saturn in general I want to talk about is, let's talk about the Saturn return. Saturn return comes every 28 to 29 years, and it's a big cycle that starts long before you get to your Saturn return. As an example, if you divide up Saturn's cycle when it returns, the 28 years, into quarters or squares and oppositions, you start, and at 7 years old, roughly, you start going out into the world. Roughly 6 or 7, you're no longer in the insular home. You're meeting other children in school. You're kind of going out there a bit more and pushing yourself out into the public sphere, which is a big part of what Saturn is about. By 14, when Saturn opposes its original position, you're hitting puberty. You're getting interested in the opposite sex or the same sex, depending upon what your preferences are. But you're suddenly being aware that you're supposed to connect with somebody else, perhaps, or that there's more out there than just playing in the sandbox together. And then at 21, well, legally, you're an adult. Yeah, you can vote, you can buy alcohol, you can, buy a gun, whatever it might be. But that's the legal aspect of it. You really don't become an adult, according to astrology, until you have your Saturn return. Excuse me. And the reason is Saturn represents authority, how authority, as you're growing and as you're growing up and becoming an adult, you get authority and you get structure from your parents. You get it from the church. You get it from school. You get it from the police. You get it from the courts. You get it from the neighborhood. And this is where you first get your authority from. This is where the limitations are set. What happens when Saturn reaches its original place as a Saturn return, you become your own authority. Okay, you're now the one in charge. You're now the one that's actually grown up, and you're the one going to be taking the steps you need to do. There's a great astrologer named Samuel Reynolds who made a great point about the Saturn return, and he said that is when you start getting the return on your investment. You've invested 28 years into learning what it's all about in the physical world, and now it's time to, if you haven't already, finally become who you are, arrive what you're doing. My example in my first Saturn return was I became an astrologer. I'd spent 8 to 10 years being a professional graphic designer, and I stayed with that. But this is when I discovered astrology. This is when I became over the next course of a couple of years of professional astrology, because that was ultimately a bigger part of what was in my chart than just being a graphic designer. So when your Saturn return comes, if you've been, it's a little dramatic, but if you've been living a lie up until your Saturn return, Saturn comes in and goes, you can't live this lie anymore. And if you keep trying to live it, it will fall apart, because Saturn will take from you what you don't need. Now, what you think you don't need is something completely different, okay? So Saturn will remove from you what you don't need, and Saturn wants you to take what you do need, and that's the key thing about a Saturn return. As for the second Saturn return, which happens around 58, and I'm 63, I've been through both of them, I find, generally speaking, the second Saturn return is a little milder. I think it's a point of taking stock. Saturn always loves taking stock and figuring out, you know what, you're getting to the next part of your life. If you're not retiring, you're going to hopefully start making more decisions about what you want and what you need to do. It's a great time for cutting out stuff. For those of you that know enough about astrology, my Saturn is conjunct my Mars on my descendant, and I spend half of my Saturn return working with my wife, cleaning out our storage locker and getting rid of a lot of stuff that I didn't need anymore. So it was somewhat poetic, because I got to work with my wife with my Saturn in the 7th, as opposed to whatever else I do that drives her crazy. Now, an important thing too to remember about Saturn as it moves through the charts, and we'll get into transits a little later on, but I want to point out to those of you aware of it, a progressed moon moon takes 28 days roughly to circle the zodiac, and Saturn takes 28 years. So if you have an aspect in your chart between Saturn and the moon, it stays in aspect your entire life, because the progressed moon is keeping up with the transiting Saturn. You have Saturn square the moon in your natal chart, your progressed moon will always square your transiting Saturn. So that's an interesting combination and tidbit to be aware of when you're dealing with clients and whatnot. Those old whatnot people. So Saturn, just give me 1 second here. Saturn and the signs. Every sign that Saturn turns up in, it's trying to find the balance between the traits of the signs, what's too much and what's not enough. So you have Saturn in Aries, which is considered its fall because it's a very forceful kind of way of setting up your structure. As a result, you have a test of self-centeredness in some way, shape, or form. Aries, of course, always wants to do whatever the hell it wants to do and doesn't want to have any interference. And Saturn does not big on that. Saturn is always about the social contract and what are the rules here and how do you behave. So to a certain degree with Saturn in Aries, you'll find it blunting initiative. There's a need to learn some patience there to discover when you can just charge forward like Aries the Ram and when it might not be that great an idea to learn how to do it. It can produce irresponsible action. It can lead to setbacks if you don't respect your Saturn in Aries. Saturn in Taurus, which loves its stuff, is a test of ownership. There's usually a fairly good handling of money with a person with Saturn in Taurus, depending upon where it falls in the chart. I'm being a little generic here. There's a steadfast quality. There is a risk with Saturn in Taurus of going too far and becoming over materialistic and being more interested in stuff than what really matters in life. Saturn in Gemini. Gemini is the information collector, the logic. They want information. They pull things to them all the time. And so Saturn becomes, in Gemini, a test of learning to have faith, learning to go with intuition, deciding when is too much information not necessary, when do you find that balance. There is a very good logic with Saturn in Gemini, but there's definitely a need for mental discipline. Oh, Saturn discipline. Oh, what do you know? Okay, Cancer. Saturn in Cancer, it's the detriment. And it is a bit of a struggle. It's the test of responsibility and empathy, because Cancer, as we know, is excellent at feeling their own emotions. Their own emotions are the most interesting things in the world to a Cancerian. And so the problem becomes, well, when do you take it too far? When do you stop being empathetic and when do you stop being compassionate? Because to a certain degree, when a Cancer is being nurturing, and we know they have a tendency to be that way, and Cancerian energy nurtures, it's really more about the nurturer necessarily than being empathetic, unless they're a very evolved and healthy nurturer. So we have someone who has emotional restraint, Saturn in Cancer. There's a risk of avoiding helping others, which is why learning to have empathy is important. And they become very, very security conscious, which Cancer already is to start with, but now they're putting their structure into a Saturnian Cancerian kind of quality. So lock the doors, we have to protect the home. Saturn in Leo. Saturn struggles in Leo, since Leo is the avatar of ego, so to speak. Yeah, that's right. It's a test of humility when you have Saturn in Leo. How far do you take it? How far do you not take it? You can be, with Saturn in Leo, hampered by your own ego when you're making mistakes with it, and when you're screwing things up. You have a problem solving self-control in some way. It's something you're not really comfortable with. You want to be Leo. Here I am. No. Self-control. Pull it back a bit. And there is a risk of egotism and arrogant pride with Saturn in Leo. Saturn in Virgo. This is a mixed bag here, because Virgo certainly appreciates and understands rules and structure and practicality and having a point to things. And but Virgo is a little judgmental, have you noticed? So the lesson here is the test of discrimination. When do you judge things? When do you let them go? When does something not have to be 100% pure? When can it be acceptable the way it is? The problem here is, you may be, with Saturn in Virgo, you may be good with detail and efficiency, but you can get caught up in pettiness and too much detail and too much fussing going on. Saturn in Libra, the test of, well, of course, relating. And it's considered an exaltation in Libra, and I can see that because the balance is already there. Saturn is always looking to sort of balance things out and make sure this is better or worse than the other. Well, now we have a naturally striving for compromise and support of other people, and you need to examine your willingness to cooperate when Saturn is in Libra, but it functions fairly well in Libra. Saturn in Scorpio. Desire, outgoing desire is the big test here. There's that incredible passion with Scorpio, and it's being put into a system of control. So people using this Saturn to structure things in their lives are very much going to be emotionally connected to the structures they create, to the point of where it has to be that way, because they're emotionally invested in the most Scorpionic kind of a way. So obviously, they handle a lot of situations in secrecy with Saturn in Scorpio, and they may arouse suspicion as a result, because they're always sneaking around. I would like to say I have Saturn in Scorpio, and I'm also a Capricorn. So, yeah, people wonder why I don't volunteer more information. As a result, Saturn in Scorpio can create its own obstacles by not cooperating, and then people turn against them and decide, well, wait, if you're not cooperating with me, what's going on here? Saturn in Sag is a tricky mix. Sagittarius wants to expand, wants to open up, wants to take everything higher and further. Saturn's ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter and Saturn make a nice little yin-yang in how they function. As I've often joked, Jupiter will buy you another drink, and Saturn will tell you when you've had enough. So putting it in the sign of expansion, what we have here is the test of understanding. It's one thing to learn and pull new information in and go further and further, but are you getting something out of it? What's the practical use you're putting all this information to? As a result, although Jupiter, hold on a second. Although Sagittarius tends to be about higher spirituality, there can be, with Saturn and Sag, a tendency to go for the traditional. They can be very ethical because they're Sagittarius, but they can take it too far. And they can, when they go on the dark side of Saturn in Sagittarius, become moral and rigid. Okay. Saturn in Capricorn. Oh, Saturn loves to be in Capricorn, right? We all know it's in its dignity, it's in its rulership, um, and it's not always perfect that way. It's about the test of the use of power. Capricorns, our energy is very connected with the use of power because they're always running around manipulating and trying to get things done. So the question becomes, um, you generates ambition and discipline, but it can also create its own obstacles and hardships. They need to understand hard work. There's also a tendency to hoard with Saturn in Capricorn, and you may want to keep an eye on that. Saturn in Aquarius is also in its dignity since it's the old co-ruler of Aquarius. Aquarius is about new ideas, new concepts, and your mind really working in the direction of the world problems. But there's a test of responsibility that needs to be worked out with Aquarius and Saturn. Aquarius can be, when Saturn and Aquarius goes bad, so to speak, you can have the scientist that works out things and doesn't really care what the results are. Hey, look, I've invented a new way to kill 27 people. I can drop this bomb and wipe out, the entire neighborhood. Well, where's your responsibility? That's the risk of Aquarius and Saturn. They may need to learn to, because it can heighten detachment. I mean, Aquarius is already a little bit of a detached sign. Put Saturn in there, and they pull back a bit. They can pull back a bit too much. There's a risk of being overly rational and unemotional. They need to learn via peer response. They're going to have to listen to people and what they're saying to them and how they're responding. And then we come around finally to Saturn in Pisces. Which is Saturn is very empathetic. Not Saturn. Pisces is very empathetic and will attach themselves to everybody emotionally. And Saturn in Pisces becomes the test of detachment. You want to try to restrict a bit of the compassion. There is a risk as a result of a certain amount of hopelessness. If Pisces can't unite with everybody in the world, what's the meaning of life? Dear God. So no, you want to stay away from that. There needs to be a cultivation of a realistic emotional state. Not that you can't be connected to everybody in the world, but how do you use it in a practical way? And the failure to cope, the resistance, that Pisces escapist tendency will just make Saturn in Pisces a lot worse, because the last thing Saturn wants you to do is escapism. So that's Saturn through the signs. And before I go through Saturn in the houses, I want to talk a little bit about Saturn and transits first, and well, aspects actually. I'm an astrologer that prefers looking at aspects first, and then I see what signs the planets are in, and then I see what houses they're in. I think aspects are strong regardless of what planets they're in. And so let's take Saturn through the planets. Saturn conjunct the sun. Well, you might as well have been born a Capricorn. It can be a bit restrictive. It can be focused. It's not the end of the world. Take a look. If you're looking at someone's chart, what's their moon up to? What's going on with Mars and Jupiter, and see how you can alleviate perhaps the over instinct of Saturn on the sun, or opposing the sun or squaring the sun, a difficult aspect. Saturn trining the sun, roll with it. It really works well, but it's the opposition and the square and even the conjunction that can become a bit limiting. Regard the person a bit like a Capricorn and see what else in the chart indicates how you can loosen them up. So, excuse me a moment. Saturn conjunct the moon. This is the tricky one. Often implies a restrictive childhood. The moon can suggest childhood influences. Restrictive can mean a lot of things. They can be poverty-stricken. They can have draconian and very strict parents in some level or way or form, where they felt they had to grow up too soon. Saturn on the moon is often about a child that has to grow up too soon and become responsible too soon. This could be the oldest sibling, perhaps, who suddenly has to become the lieutenant parent, so to speak, underneath the parent, or perhaps somebody has left the family and they end up having to become more responsible for people in the family. Emotions can come out. There may be a resistance to getting close to people. I'm going to drag Venus in here too, because there's similarities here. You really want to encourage anybody with difficult aspects between the moon and Saturn and Venus and Saturn to push against them a bit, because otherwise it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, particularly with something like Saturn conjunct the moon, you pull your emotions back and you go, oh, I can't trust anybody with my emotions. And then people look at you and go, you know, that person never shares their emotions, so I'm not even going to bother talking to them, or not, you know. And then you go, see, nobody wants to hear what I'm feeling. So it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm going to jump over Mercury. I'll come back to it, but as long as we're talking about Venus, it's the same thing. I had a client a few weeks ago who had Saturn opposite her Venus, and she was complaining that, you know, well, not complaining, she was actually telling me that she preferred to keep people at arm's length. But it's a funny thing at work. Everybody treats her like an outsider, and they kind of shun her, and they don't invite her out to lunch. And I said, well, you've created this. You know, what happens sometimes is when you're not, Saturn is conjunct Venus, you hold back to connecting to other people, and other people start going, well, who the hell does she or he think he is? Oh, he's all stuck up. We don't need to talk to him. And again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I suggested to this woman, take some baby steps. I know you're never going to feel comfortable around people, but you really need to get past that. You've got to find that Saturnine balance, even when it's a harsh aspect. Saturn wants to balance it out. It wants to cut the crap out and focus on what really matters in the planet that it is aspecting, even when it's a difficult aspect. Yes, you will fall in love even if you have Venus opposite Saturn. It's not the end of the world, honestly. Okay, Saturn and Mercury, it's not that difficult. The biggest risk I find Saturn conjunct Mercury, well, you got a really organized mind. You may tend to be more traditionally based unless Uranus and or Neptune are giving you your brain a bit of a push, because you do need to be more open-minded with Saturn conjunct Mercury. You may have your own limitations to your beliefs and your thoughts and how you're processing it. Okay. But even in opposition, the biggest thing with the oppositions, any Saturn in opposition, is you put Saturn on the outside person, whether Saturn is opposing Mars or Venus or the moon or whatever. Outside people become Saturn. And so you may find with Saturn opposite Mercury, you're struggling with people that you feel are trying to suppress your ideas and hold you back. Again, baby steps, cooperation with authorities. Use Saturn to cooperate with authority. It'll work better. Use Saturn to focus what you're doing and making sure that you've done your homework. Saturn, an opposition will not become that difficult a problem. Saturn and Mars, not a problem in my personal experience. I have Saturn conjunct Mars in Scorpio, and once I got past some of the early problems, it functions really well. What are the problems? Easy, stop and start. Mars wants to take off. Saturn says hold back. So I would often stop things and stop them and start them and stop them and not quite get anything done. The other possibility is when you see a car trying to get out of mud or snow or ice, you'll see somebody gunning the engine and the wheels spinning and nobody's going anywhere. And that can be the other problem when Saturn is conjunct Mars. There can be a spinning of the wheels and not really getting anything done. But when it works well together, I will say they're beautiful. They're wonderful because Saturn keeps Mars from charging off a cliff, and Mars keeps Saturn from just sitting there doing nothing. So a Mars conjunct Saturn can function fairly well together. One of the things I have found, however, Saturn conjunct Mars, once a person with that has figured out what they're going to do, once they've worked out their Saturn and Mars, they do not brook interference. They've figured it out. They've got their plans, and you can go to hell if you're going to interfere with them. I can say I noticed it in my chart, and once again, my wife will point that out. But I've seen it in other people. Saturn conjunct Mars, when they're working it out and it's functioning, that's it. They're going to do what they're going to do. Saturn square Mars, you have to work out your habits. You're obviously not organizing yourself well enough. You're using Saturn to stop Mars. You're using Mars to keep Saturn from creating discipline. So it's a balance that you need to put into order, so to speak. And as Isabel Hickey has said, a more evolved individual will turn squares into trines. So squares can be worked with. They're a wonderful gift, but they have to be worked with and handled, so to speak. Saturn conjunct Jupiter is actually pretty good. One of the things that turns up in a lot of the books is it's eventual success. Wherever it turns up, Saturn conjunct Jupiter will bring you success. You'll have a careful expansion. You'll have some limitations, but they won't overwhelm you. They can actually balance each other out pretty well. And although things need to be worked out, if you find out where it falls in the chart and it's not badly aspected, it will lead to eventual success in whatever area it does turn up. Saturn and the outer planets. Oh boy. Saturn and Uranus conjunct can actually function fairly well in a more kind of extreme version of Jupiter conjunct Saturn, where there's a quality of the craziness of chaos of Uranus will be held in check by Saturn, but Uranus will not let Saturn get particularly crazy. If you have Saturn opposite Uranus, you're going to feel other people are always dragging you down, man, because you got these great crazy ideas and they don't want to listen. Again, you're putting Saturn in someone else's hands when it's in opposition. Learn to get the two to work together. Saturn and Uranus really make a great couple. Saturn and Neptune. This is a tough one. I don't know if you can find two planets with less in common than Saturn and Neptune, because Saturn is so about the physical universe and how we create it and how we structure it. And in my opinion, Neptune is about denying the physical universe. If you're going to get spiritual, you have to leave physical reality behind. And if you're going to become a drug addict and an alcoholic, you're also going to have to leave physical reality behind. So there's a genuine struggle. I think it's every 35 or 40 years, Saturn and Neptune conjunct. I don't know the exact numbers, forgive me, please. It's a tough struggle for the native with it in their chart, because Saturn wants structure and Neptune doesn't want any structure whatsoever. It's all about everything, man. And so that can be really difficult. And ideally, you could work it out to be practical spirituality. On a healthier side of things, you could find a way to perhaps bring structure to your spirituality that matters. You could also use Neptune and Saturn in any kind of a creative career in the sense of the arts, writing, painting, music. But creativity doesn't have to be confined to the arts. If you can work out your creativity and apply it, I mean, an architect you could look upon as somebody that might be a Neptune-Saturn kind of thing, because they'll create places for people to work or live, and they're taking their creativity and putting it into a physical structure. And so it can work out, Neptune conjunct Saturn, but it can be very confusing. You're hoping in a natal chart to find aspects that people can connect better with. And Saturn and Pluto, boy, have you got discipline. Saturn conjunct Pluto, your discipline is nuclear powered, and you're really kind of in control. Just keeping an eye on time. I'm going to zip through the Saturn and the houses. There's a couple more things I want to mention. Saturn in the first house gives you sort of a serious outlook. You really can't be talked to with Saturn in the first house. You'll tend to put a wall up. Michael Luton once made a great joke. How do you do a reading for a person with Saturn in the first house? You let them do it themselves, because you won't be able to tell them anything. Saturn in the second house. Yes, it can restrict your finances, but you will get anything you've earned. You put the time in, you put the effort in. Saturn will fill your bank account, depending, of course, on aspects to the rest of the chart. And you could also be a bit naturally thrifty, as the words go. Saturn in the third house stabilizes the mind, kind of focuses the person very well. You may have difficulty with close relationships with your siblings or your family, or more your siblings in your local neighborhoods, because Saturn kind of makes you a bit restrictive in that direction. But you're well-spoken, you can think things through, and you're really not into small talk. With Saturn in the third. Saturn in the fourth house, burdensome family obligations. You may find yourself stuck with family obligations and what can or cannot be done with them. You may find family ties are dragging you down, but you're the one that is the one that's responsible, so to speak. Saturn in the fifth house, creative self-expression. Can be limited, can be focused. You may have trouble with your children because you may not be able to connect to them either because of limitations and restrictions holding them back. Saturn in the sixth house, a serious, responsible worker. Work can be tough. It's the workplace, so you may find a person struggling to just get things done, and never a breeze for them. It is also the house of health. So Saturn in the sixth house of health talks about it takes a person time to heal. People Saturn in the sixth house do not heal quickly. There's also a risk if you're going to get sick. Saturn will give you osteoporosis. It can give you arthritis. Anything that limits movement in some way, shape, or form can be a Saturnine illness in the sixth house. Saturn in the seventh house, so you can have an enduring, lasting relationship if you can, but you may be reluctant to get married at first. You may want to find who you are first, because you may find when a marriage brings Saturn more strongly into your life, and so you may, as many people do, get married later in life with Saturn in the seventh house. Saturn in the eighth house limits your financial benefits from other people. The marriage may be parsimonious. Business partners may put heavy crap on you through obligations and responsibilities. You may have trouble getting your inheritances. And sometimes death can be prolonged. Again, keep an eye on what other aspects are going on to Saturn, but Saturn does suggest that it may be a prolonged death in some way, shape, or form. Saturn in the ninth house, well, now we have people that are entirely too rigid with their spiritual beliefs and their higher education. So you may find them very limited in their beliefs. And travel is usually business oriented. It's the house of travel, but Saturn is making it practical. And you're very responsible towards your in-laws with Saturn in the ninth, but doesn't mean you necessarily get along well with them. Saturn hits home in the 10th. Yes, it delays a successful career until you've done your homework, but it does intensify your career ambitions and your drive for status. If it's adversely aspected, it can become overwhelming. Like career matters more than anything, but it should work out fairly well if you do your homework. We'll get into transits in a second with that one. Saturn works out well in the 11th house. We have a limited number of general friendships, but the friendships you do have last and hang in there. And you may choose people that are more Saturnine as your friends, more serious-minded, more mature in some way, shape, or form. And obviously, professional organizations will be career-based and practically oriented. It won't be a poetry reading workshop. It'll be how do we clean up the slums and how do we purify the water kind of social groups. And finally, Saturn in the 12th, yes, it can bring loneliness. It can limit your connection to your subconscious. Career interests can be often associated with charitable organizations. It's very good to work with limited people in some way, shape, or form in hospitals or reformatories or any confined areas. Now I'm going to move into transits. If anybody has anything they want to ask, you're welcome to, what I've said so far, you're welcome to ask it. And, excuse me, I want to stay in the picture here. Or otherwise we'll just move into transiting planets.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Anthony, you mentioned earlier on Saturn in Scorpio.
Yes.
So you said secrecy, emotional investments, and can arouse suspicion. And I do see that this is not myself. But would you say they rely heavily on other people's resources and in this way can control others?
Yeah, I would. I hadn't necessarily thought of it in those words, but actually poetically it makes a lot of sense because Saturn can be very manipulative, and Scorpio is certainly quite capable of reading people right down to the core of who they are. So there certainly could be a hopefully evolved use of emotions in manipulation of other people. But obviously without the evolved part of it, you could certainly jerk people around by tapping into their neuroses and their inner fears.
Yes, I have seen that operate. Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Any other general Saturnine questions before we go to transits? Okay. Generally speaking, Saturn transits focus any planet it crosses over. Some of them are easier than others. Saturn on the sun or Saturn on the moon, you can feel very choked off. You can feel a little depressed. Saturn on the sun wants you to cut the crap out of your life. You don't need any more. Saturn always wants you to throw out the stuff that isn't practical and that isn't working. With the sun, it can be a little depressive because that's who you are. It's the center of your solar system. And so it becomes a struggle to sort of let go of those things. Saturn on the moon is even perhaps a bit more difficult. Saturn and the moon don't always get along. Saturn is not necessarily understanding of the moon's needs and emotional sides. You may find, though, yourself straightening your home up, getting rid of the crap you don't need. It's a great time for a spring cleaning, maybe not a spring cleaning, a life cleaning of your home, so to speak. You may find struggles with your mom if she's still around, or whoever played the role of mom in your life. Saturn and Mercury, again, not a difficult transit, but you may feel limited in your thinking. You may say, yeah, I can't come up with any great ideas. It's almost like having Mercury retrograde in your brain for the time that Saturn is passing over your Mercury. Saturn passing your Venus. Well, if you're in a relationship, it's going to be a test. And if the relationship is a healthy, functioning relationship, hey, it'll survive Saturn on Venus. If there's problems in the relationship, Saturn on Venus will bring up, hey, what about this crap? And then, of course, how you deal with it depends upon whether or not your relationship will continue. Saturn on Mars, a great time to start a focused project, but it may not be a great time to start anything new because you may find it difficult to get something started. So if something's already going, focus on it and get it done, and use Saturn on Mars as a way of really kind of accomplishing something. Saturn on Jupiter, it's a great time to go back to college, so to speak, and I don't mean that necessarily literally, but like a Jupiter return, which encourages you to learn new things, Saturn will want you to learn new things when it hits Jupiter, except they've got to be practical things, so no philosophy courses, no poetry courses, but if you want to take a course in how to fix your car or how to learn a new language because you're going to be traveling, well, Saturn on Jupiter is happy to help you. But Saturn on Jupiter will also restrict your risk-taking. It will restrict your optimism, so it can be a bit of a drag when it transits that. Saturn on Saturn, well, we talked about that. That's the Saturn return stuff. And Saturn on Uranus, you may be struggling with freedom. You may feel very hemmed in, Uranus being about personal freedom and what you need to get to and whatever you want to do, and you want to do what you want to do, and Saturn says, wait a minute, you got to be responsible here, and it's a struggle. A transit of Saturn on Neptune is better than Neptune on Saturn. Saturn on Neptune will focus your spirituality, again, depending upon where you are in your evolution and growth on your path. You may find Saturn on Neptune to make you feel very depressed about spirituality and feeling very disconnected. If you're healthy or involved, you may come up with new meditation techniques. You may come up with Saturn on Neptune, probably be a great time to check out yoga or Tai Chi or anything that might involve structure and limitation and a spiritual kind of a basis and function. Saturn on Pluto, I got them all right. Saturn on Pluto, I think you really have to look at what's aspecting Pluto. Pluto can be a very quiet planet in a chart if it is not aspected and drawn into the chart, the rest of the chart. If it is crossing over Pluto and Pluto is important in your chart, you may find kind of a little bit of a Pluto return going on there in the sense that Saturn will, because Pluto likes to also get rid of stuff in your life. When Pluto transits your moon or whatever, you'll find stuff from your childhood coming up needing to get rid of. Saturn is a little more surfacey in terms of getting rid of things in your life than Pluto is. Combined together, you may find it an upheaval, a very focused, structured upheaval. You may find limitations in your life forcing you to deal with sort of Plutonian topics. And the last four things I want to talk about is when Saturn crosses the angles, the rising sign, midheaven, nadir, and descendant. These are important places. And when it gets to the midheaven, actually, since we were talking about Saturn in the 10th house I mentioned earlier, Saturn, when it crosses your midheaven, is a big deal. It's a culmination of 14 years of work. And if you haven't done your homework, Saturn crossing your midheaven will take it away from you. It'll take away your career. Robert Hand in his book makes a point of pointing his finger at Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's Saturn crossed his midheaven, and within 2 years he was out of the presidency with Watergate. Because why? He hadn't done his homework. He was trying to sneak around and not have integrity. Yeah, I mentioned integrity earlier, right? About Saturn, you better have integrity. He didn't have the integrity, and he got swept out of office as a result of that. So if you've done your homework, you've arrived at your career. This can be a pinnacle in many ways of your career. It doesn't mean necessarily the best moment of your career. I'm not saying it's downhill from there, but rather it's you've arrived, and now you know what you're doing. When Saturn's success finally comes to the 10th house, it's not if you've done it right, you can't be knocked off your perch because you know what you're doing, and you've arrived. Saturn crossing over, let's go to the opposite side, the nadir. It's the end of a low period. Saturn's reached the bottom of the chart, and now it's heading back up. So we have, it's on its way up. It's starting a new cycle. The personal, because the fourth house is the nature of the psyche, and the domestic are very important at this point because your Saturn in the fourth house from the nadir into the fourth house is talking about, by transit, setting up a new foundation. You're starting, like I say, a 14-year cycle. What's the groundwork you're laying? Where you're going with it? Saturn on the ascendant, excuse me, responsibilities increase. You need to finish old tasks because it's on its way down, and now it's going to be curving underneath. So it's really kind of a good time to finish things up. You need to simplify, and of course Saturn on the ascendant, just stop with the walls. Don't build up walls. I know you're going to get Saturn on the ascendant, you're going to go away, everybody go away. Don't do that. Just put yourself forward as a structured, focused, experienced individual that's wrapping things up and getting things done. And finally, Saturn on the descendant is a lot like excuse me. Saturn on the descendant is a lot like Saturn on Venus. You may find a strain in your intimacy. Even if your relationship's working out, you may not feel that engaged in it. You may only look at the relationship for practical reasons, perhaps. There may be, others may tend to oppose you because it's opposite your ascendant. And you need to weed out your one-to-one relationships when Saturn passes through your seventh house. Decide which one of your close, intimate friends or lovers or business partners are legit and useful to you in some way, and useful is not always just practical. Then you keep them. And if they're dragging you around and being a pain in the ass, then it's time to cut those people loose. So to wrap up, the thing that I think is actually most important about Saturn is remembering that it's the beliefs we choose to have. Admittedly, they were somewhat imposed upon us as we were growing up, but we're not kids anymore. We're grown up. That's the whole point of the Saturn return, is you become your own authority. And I think of the analogy, which I picked up from an ACOA meeting, years and years ago. You know, you nearly drowned when the boat sank, but the life preserver saved your life. And then it's 20 years later and you still haven't taken the life preserver off. And you don't need it. And that is what held on to behavior that's baggage is like. It's like wearing a life preserver 20 years after you don't need it anymore. When you were a kid, you had to accept what was going on. You don't have to accept it anymore, but you have to realize that you've created that. You have to realize that if you want to be happy, you're going to have to be a bit uncomfortable. You're going to have to break free of the limitations that you voluntarily took on. You have to acknowledge it's voluntary, and then you have to do something about it. And Saturn's on your side. Saturn wants to function healthy and well and smoothly, and I'm sure a lot of us know there's plenty of that baggage from the past that is not making our lives easier. So the beliefs that we think are facts, that's how we structure our physical world. And one example of viewpoints, the last symbol I want to use, is two people can be walking down the street, and across the street they see two other people rush, one person rushing towards another. And one person says, "Oh my God, they're going to get mugged." And the other person thinks, oh, look, they're going to hug each other. That's the baggage you're carrying. Who knows what's going on across the street? What it's about is what your interpretation is and what you carry with you and how you impose that upon the world. And you have control of that. So we have a wee bit of minutes left. Are there any questions about anything I've said? It's basic Saturn stuff.
That was amazing, Anthony. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope it made sense.
Yes, absolutely. So thorough. Thank you. I've got a few questions, but I'm hoping other people can ask as well. So Saturn will be entering my third house very soon. Any quick advice?
Soon as in it's going to be in Capricorn or it's in
Yes.
Sag? Okay.
It will be in the third house soon and be in Capricorn soon at the same time. Yeah.
You may find trouble with your if you have siblings or immediate neighbors. You may want to have practical relations with them, and you may find some of the warmth go out of what's going on. I consider house cusps, except for the angles, a little flexible because Alcibiades equal house, Placidus, who knows what anybody's using. So, but you may want to find a way to connect to your neighbors in a practical way. You may want to, otherwise there may be limitations there. You may find neighbors or family becoming Saturnine if you don't embrace Saturn. That's one of the truths. Go ahead. That's
so true. That it's starting to happen already. So thanks for that explanation. That's great.
You always, if you seize what Saturn's doing, you can control it. If you let it happen, then you can become a victim.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you so much.
No
Any
problem.
other questions from anybody?
All quiet in the Western Front.
Okay, well, I have another one. Saturn and fear. Saturn can correlate to self-judgment, right? Judgment and self-judgment. And in other words, the father principle turned against oneself, right? So we're judging ourselves. So how does a good father principle operate in terms of natural law?
That's a good way to put it. Part of it, part of it is overcoming. You have to look at the source of the fear. There's fear is very useful when it's healthy. Okay, if you have a gut instinct that the person you're talking to is dangerous, trust it. If an animal in the forest, when it's drinking from the water, it's constantly listening for sounds, and its fear is motivating it. So fear can be very healthy. The problem is when it gets out of hand, you become afraid of everything with judgmental qualities. The part of the way to deal with that is to learn to maybe even take stock of yourself in terms of keeping a notebook, marking like, hey, I succeeded at this. Hey, this worked out fine. Because a lot of the times it's your viewpoint. You could have 10 wonderful things happen to you during the week, but you're so bent on beating yourself up that you'll say, well, but 3 lousy things happened this week. It was a lousy week, and never add in the equation that, but you did 12 things perfectly fine. And you're doing better than you want, than you realize. So sometimes I actually think it becomes Saturnine. You take a notebook, make a list everything that happened that week, and try to see why you're choosing what you're listing.
That's great. Yes. Thank you so much. And I do have one final question. I have Saturn in Sag, and here's my current philosophy: is people need to take responsibility for themselves and for the karma that they've created in their lives, and to stop projecting their problems onto others and onto the world. What do you think of that one?
I definitely agree with it. I don't know where compassion is in your chart and empathy, because there is a middle ground there. People do need to take responsibility, but if they need a hand up, if you need somebody pull you up to like a set of stairs, I'll pull you up. Then after that, go what you want to do. So yes, people should take responsibility, and the people that aren't taking responsibility, don't help them. Absolutely, because they're just going to suck the life out of you. But if you recognize that somebody's actually trying and is struggling, then I say give them a hand. You know, we're not all equal. It's one of the great things I learned from astrology is that, you know, maybe their Mars is in Pisces. They're having trouble getting something done as a result. And well, my Mars is in Scorpio. Maybe I can help show them how to take direction, provided they're looking for it. See, that's where I divide the line in terms of expecting people to take responsibility. If they just need a hand and they're doing well, I give them a hand. If you're going to suck the blood out of me, bye-bye. So that's where I divide it.
Okay. Oh, that's great advice. Thank you so much. So any final questions from anybody or final comments?
I love that. I also have Mars in Scorpio, and I'm the same way, you know, and the same as Linda. You know, it's like people need to take responsibility for themselves. Well, I also have Saturn and Virgo conjunct my Virgo sun, so
oh boy,
I'm like a Capricorn, as you said.
Yeah.
But I do believe that like you said, and I really appreciate you said that some people that may have, for example, Mars in Pisces, don't have that strength and need a hand and may not have that direction, and people don't have the same abilities. But thank you so much for.
Oh yeah, Virgo definitely has to learn that one, because there's always that goal of perfection, and I love telling Virgos there's such a thing as good enough. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Isn't. No, it's got to be perfect.
Yeah, we already live in a perfect world.
I know, one to learn.
You got to redefine what perfect is.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. My sister always says, good enough for who it's for.
There you go.
And I used to always say, good enough for government work when I worked for the post office. So, yeah.
Okay.
Which is, you know, definitely good enough. Whatever.
Yeah, that's true of the post office. Anyway.
Thank you, Anthony.
My pleasure.
Okay, Anthony, okay, we'll wind down, but just before we go, where is your Mercury? What house and sign?
I have a Mercury in Capricorn, conjunct Venus and conjunct the Sun.
Ah, beautiful.
On my midheaven.
Wow, had Pluto gone over them yet?
I'm looking forward to that next year.
Oh, wow, okay.
It's on my midheaven, and I also have my North Node in Chiron, all bundled together in that little Capricorn bundle.
That's amazing.
24 degrees to about 20 degrees.
You're going to really enjoy it. I have Venus and Mercury in Capricorn. Pluto's already gone over them, and it's approaching my Sun in Capricorn, and I just love Pluto transits. They're amazing.
Okay.
No, they really are.
They can
okay.
be if you're open to them.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, I wish you well in that. And thank you so much again from me and everybody. I'll just unmute everyone, and then they can just tell you how they felt about the meeting. Okay.
Awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome.
Love everything you said.
Okay. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Cheerio. Catch you another time, I hope.
If I come up with anything else, I'll definitely broadcast it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye.